and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking with author Melissa Petro about her debut book, Shame on You: How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification. We also discuss the book Mother Hunger: How Adult Daughters Can Understand and Heal from Lost Nurturance, Protection, and Guidance by Kelly McDaniel. In Shame on You, Melissa Petro takes on the issue of women's shame directly, with an unflinching look at the social systems that encourage women to believe that we are deeply inadequate. Blending investigative reporting, science, literature, and hundreds of women's personal stories, including her own, Petro offers us a new way forward.
In Mother Hunger, licensed professional counselor Kelly McDaniel helps women identify and break the cycle of destructive behavior by taking a fresh look at childhood trauma and its lasting impact. In doing so, she destigmatizes the shame that comes with being undermothered and misdiagnosed. McDaniel offers a healing path with powerful tools that include therapeutic interventions and lifestyle changes in service to healthy relationships. It was such an invigorating conversation to hear Melissa's own personal story and her collection of other women's stories, and a great look at shame. And we really got into it, and including some fun projects she might be going into in the future. So hope you enjoy. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
Hey, ladies. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're so excited to talk to you today. We just chatted a little bit beforehand, but we were hoping you could just share with our listeners, like, who are you? Any parts of your identity you want to share to sort of intro yourself. And furry friends are also welcome.
I'll have like a whole menagerie of cats walking through, I'm sure. I am a cat owner and a freelance cultural journalist and author of Shame on You: How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification. I'm also a book and life story coach, and I work with writers of all experiences on telling their own stories.
I'd love to know how you got into writing. Is this something that you've always been doing? And I know this, we'll go into it more because this book is kind of part memoir, but have you been writing since you were young? Was it something that you did in school?
Like many people, I was a creative kid, and I turned to journaling as a place I could reflect and be authentic and tell my truth secretively, right? So yeah, I think I always was interested in the craft, but I never really considered writing as a career because I needed to do something that made money to make sense, to become a writer. And then in my 20s, I really needed to return to the craft to just make sense of what I had experienced. And that's when I started to take it more seriously.
And you just mentioned did you say you're an author, like you coach authors or people writing books for the first time? I'm curious about that piece.
I've worked with writers of all experiences. So I used to teach workshops in needle exchanges or even, rehabs, places where people were just in desperate places in their lives. And I would help people tell their stories, just elements of it, not their life stories. But then I also do work with writers who are interested in writing a book-length memoir or talking about a longer journey in their lives. I look at it as book coaching because a lot of writers have the ambition of writing and publishing a book, but I also look at it as life story coaching because some people do not have that ambition. They do not want to publish a book or necessarily share it with anybody. They just want that story out of themselves and onto a page. So I've learned how to help people tell their stories. It's a bit of narrative therapy and transformative language arts. And if people are interested in publishing, we look at it through that lens as well.
It's funny that I'm having just like this moment because we just talked a lot about narrative therapy on our last episode, and we have a lot of therapists that come on this. And so it's cool to hear that there's this like coaching part too that you've evolved into. And that must be really powerful to sit with people and yeah, I'm sure it feels a bit like therapy for you.
Well, it's tricky because I am not a therapist. I'm a
Mhm.
writer, but I just went through it myself. I learned how to make meaning of the events of my lives and to construct a narrative and a compelling narrative and to adopt this pride identity of writer, which sort of displaces the essentialized bad self that we feel we might be. And I looked into it because I intellectualize everything. So I did look into, what narrative therapy is and how transformative language arts is both therapeutic, but also craft. And yeah, it was just really so invaluable to myself and leading other people on that journey of, meaning making and storytelling just felt so natural. It was just such a joyous experience to meet people where they were at and to uncover the beautiful stories we all have and to find a story we can live in. I think that is what I had to do for myself. For a very long time, I had a story that was so incredibly uncomfortable. It was a story that essentialized me as a bad person who'd done bad things. And that isn't a story you can really live in. You can't make good choices from that. So retelling my own story and teaching others to retell their stories and to reconnect with their goals and to really identify the conflicts and, well, how do we overcome these conflicts and achieve our goals? That's narrative therapy, and that's what I had to do. Yeah, it's really beautiful to be able to take control of your life again when you felt you've lost it, and to be with people doing that it's a gift.
I really like that idea of finding a story that you can live in because I hold that as not, negating the impact of your story on others necessarily, but really venturing through your own internal terrain around it and coming up with like a story that you can, yeah, essentially live in. That's a cool way to think about it.
Well, I think of stories as containers. We talk a lot about finding safe containers. And I think for a lot of people, their first safe container is a page. It's a journal. It's their own kind of, internal processes where they're making sense of what's happening. And if we can make sense of it in a way that feels safe and forward thinking, then, it calms our nervous system and we can start making more intelligent, wise-minded choices from that place. So, if we can come up with a story, and it's a true story, and there's many versions of a true story, right? But this is the true story that feels most comfortable, then we move forward from there. And just knowing how it feels to not have that story, and then knowing how it feels to have it, it's just so transformative. So I love that I'm able to give that gift to people, because writers do come to me and they're just so unresolved. They don't know how to end their books, or they don't know what they're trying to tell. They just know there's this urgency in their bodies and in their minds, and they just have to write this book. So it's very easy for me as an outsider to kind of plot out what we describe as a major dramatic question. You're on a journey. What were your goals? Tangible and intangible. What were the conflicts, external and internal? Using that language too also depersonalizes it in a way. So we're not talking about you, the person. We're talking about a protagonist who is separate from you. And it is this older, wiser narrator who is making meaning of that experience. So in these ways, you're kind of lifting the story out of you. I mean, you guys just did a thing on narrative therapy, so you know what I'm talking about.
I'm like the books part of this. I work in the book industry, so I'm not a therapist. And
Right.
but it's so funny because last year I spent a good chunk of my free time digitizing my journals, like from childhood to
Mm-hmm.
like maybe a year or two. I don't know if I was brave enough to go into COVID times, but so funny. It's like an exercise that I kind of unknowingly was doing, and I got a
Right.
lot out of it. Like, just things that I think were scary before, and you revisit and you're like, oh, it actually
Right.
wasn't that bad. It's actually, this is pretty
Right.
funny.
Well, because it's a different you that it's
Mhm.
happening to. And you can look at that self in a sort of dispassionate, more objective, curiously critical way. so it doesn't feel so indicting that, it's not that like you're talking about yourself, you're talking about a character who you were then, who you are no longer, even if it's just 5 minutes later, like you are no longer that person. So you can look at that person with a real intelligent mind. At least that's what I started to do for myself in my 20s when I had experiences in the sex trade. I had made this choice that like presumably decent women would never. What did that say about me was this question. I needed to make sense of it. So I would go in there and I would write about this person who was working as a stripper in Mexico. I was no longer her. But interestingly, you do write to a sort of integration where you are her and her. You have transformed into this self that is all these things. And for me, that is incredibly healing. And for my students as well, I can see how it really helps them move forward in their lives.
It also reminds me there's so many elements of, to bring it back to the therapy world, of that sort of inner child work as well, where you're sending compassion to that version of
Absolutely.
yourself. Yeah. Wow.
Absolutely. And framing it as writing, like good writing is not, so self-critical, that doesn't feel true to a reader, nor does it just entirely externalize everything and blame others. A real thoughtful piece of writing, a piece of writing that will resonate with your readers, it does find compassion for the characters. It looks at everyone's side. There's a lot of regard for other people's points of view. So that's another element that I really am able to offer clients, is that how can we develop even more nuance so that the story is not so black and white, and how do we find compassion for ourselves, because people are deeply critical, or they avoid that criticism, and then the story feels untrue. So how can we make this story feel more true?
Well, I'm so excited to jump into your book. Before we move there, is there anything else that you would like to share just about yourself, professionally or personally?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I was a cultural journalist for 10, maybe 15 years, and I was also a public school teacher. A lot of writers have day jobs. And then after the New York Post experience, I just really became a full-time journalist and book coach, and just really committed to this idea that secrets keep us sick, and telling our truths and telling our stories free of fear of recrimination or shame is what will not only liberate ourselves but liberate our society. So when I think about myself as a writer and a writing instructor, it is more about healing, and healing the individual, personal discovery, individual transformation, but ultimately it is a political act, and we're aiming for social change here. We change ourselves, we change our world. And if the more tolerant our world becomes, hearing stories that don't necessarily fit sort of rigid norms that is expected of us, that will create a more tolerant society. So that's what I'm here to do.
Well, let's jump into your book so we can talk more about it. Shame on You by Melissa Petro. What inspired you to write this book?
So I had experiences as a woman in the sex trades, which is arguably one of the most shameful things a woman can do, is have sex for money. And it was a very unresolved story for me. And that's why I started writing. And then I started sharing my writing very, tenderly. I had published a couple pieces. And one of my very first essays that I had published was discovered by a reporter at the New York Post. And I just became a headline, which is a unique and not so unique experience. It's called mass media humiliation, when someone is kind of plucked from obscurity and mocked and made an example of. I think I endured that for maybe half a year. And ultimately, I did lose my career because I was working then as a public school teacher. And it was just inconceivable in the imagination of New York Post readers and others that a public school teacher could have once been a stripper and a prostitute. And not just that I had experiences in the sex trades, but that I dared speak about it out loud. I think that was what was most offensive to people. Like I was just so stupid in their brains to have shared this information. It's something I should have kept to kept to myself and taken to the grave. I always knew I needed to tell this story. And it began as memoir. It was memoir even before the New York Post, because I was, describing what I'd lived through and how I transformed as a result of that experience. But I couldn't really get a book out of me so long as I still needed the validation of the world, which is what my memoir was trying to achieve. I really just wanted everyone to tell me I was okay and I was right. And luckily, I had an amazing agent who did not represent memoir. And she really made me turn that lens away from myself, which was so transformative and therapeutic ultimately that I didn't write a memoir. I wrote a prescriptive nonfiction. So taking my experience and what I learned from it and really amplifying the lessons that we can all learn from what happened to me, namely that shame is not a unique experience. It is, in fact, a ubiquitous experience, and that women in particular experience shame more acutely, more frequently, and that shame is really weaponized against women in particular to keep us from achieving our goals and knowing our worth.
First of all, thank you for sharing your story with us so openly in this way. And, I can speak from my own internal experience reading it was like really connecting to not only feeling shame, because of course I'm human, but also really finding myself trying to grasp with like the bigness of, what did you call it, mass media humiliation? Because shame to me feels so personal, right? And it's like this little thing that we're like hiding away in the corner, right? And so reading your story, and I feel so grateful that you did write this and share it with all of us. The bigness of the mass media humiliation to me is like I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. And it's something I feel like is becoming more and more frequent because we live in such an age of connectedness and internet being the internet, right? What are some things that sort of helped you through that time that you now remember sort of in hindsight? Like, because like to Tara's point too, like sometimes we do these things sort of naturally to take care of ourselves without knowing that's what we need. So I'm so curious, like what you did for yourself during that.
Well, I was fortunate that when the New York Post scandal happened, I was 4 years in a program of recovery. So I had really long before hit a spiritual bottom and transformed my life, had begun a process of therapeutic recovery. So I interview a lot of women. I interview 150 plus women for the book, and I focused for a period on what I identified as extremely shame resilient women. And they all sort of have the same story, and my story as well. There's certain elements that can make a person resilient to shame, and there's different practices. I mean, the practice of having a creative outlet. So for me, it's writing. For some people, it's music or dance. Having something physical. So if it is writing, then there's something else where you're moving your body. The women I spoke to who I would describe as incredibly shame resilient, most of them went to therapy. So they had a sort of group or individual or both kind of therapy. A lot of people talked about psychedelics. Not my experience, but that is something that seems to be really helpful for people. We have a practice that helps us stay centered in a storm. That is shame resilience. So shame, this experience of just fearing that you are unlovable, whether you're being called the frosty teacher or the hooker teacher on a newspaper, which was my experience, or whether you're just beating yourself up internally because you forgot your kid's shoes or you didn't sign the permission slip. It's the same feeling. It really is. As a mother, as a former sex worker, I know it's the same feeling. So how we stay centered and move through that is the practice, the practice of being human. And I had all of these things. When the New York Post showed up at my doorstep, I was in a program of recovery. I had therapists. I had exercise. By then, I had really reclaimed my body and I was eating healthfully. I had friends that I could turn to and right size that experience, even as it's being magnified in the press. All of that really kept me alive, literally. through that experience. And I do not think the world cared if I were alive or dead. I do not think the New York Post cared what could have happened to me. And it truly, that mortification, I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that shame can kill people. Even with all my resources, it was incredibly painful and traumatic. Mass media humiliation is a traumatic experience.
Yeah, of course. This is such a big, like, I need help holding this to understand how that would feel.
But we all know how it feels because we've
Yeah,
all said the wrong thing
sure.
online and then been piled on. You know, we've all had a pile on. We've
Right.
all felt shame. It's the same kind of grip. It's this, I
Sure.
mean, it's a bit more relentless when it's
Right,
mass
right,
media.
right,
You know,
right.
but it's that same feeling. It's that feeling of wanting to just shrivel up and disappear because your belonging is so threatened. Something you've done, nay, something you are is so wrong that can't be. It has to go away. You have to hide it or you have to change it. And that's what motivates us to exhaust ourselves in this effort of to be better, to be better, to be better, to hide from that feeling.
Your book was one that, so I'm a destroyer of books. I like to write in the pages.
Love
So,
it.
but I highlighted so much out of this to just, there was just so many pieces that really spoke to me and like the way that you've described them and just like how thorough some of like the interviews and different experiences that you captured in this as well. But I really liked how you defined it, and you've touched on this a little bit about how you're defining shame, if I can quote you to you. At its core, shame is an existential feeling of unworthiness and profound inadequacy. It is not just the fear that others will find you unlovable, it is a deep down fear that you don't deserve to be loved. And just putting that language around it, like, yeah, that's yeah, we have all felt that.
And we might not identify it as shame. So I think you had asked earlier, you know, what was the impetus for this book? You know, I wanted to tell my story and I was looking for a container for it. And at that time, I was in this writing group with these very successful writers. They were on their first, second, third books. They were objectively killing it, like very successful women on paper. And they still were chronically unhappy with themselves. And they suffered from these feelings of inadequacy. And I could see, and it was so clear to see it when it was looking at another woman, like who had just that published a bestseller, but like was really beating herself up because she just couldn't get on top of the laundry. To me, it was very clear that they were outrunning a feeling of shame. There was something they feared about themselves, just wasn't good enough as it was. And it emerged as a sort of ambition or, you know, a feeling of constantly having to better themselves. And I just wanted for them to know that they were enough. And then that made me realize for myself that I was enough. You know, at that point, I didn't have a book. I was comparing myself to these people and I was less than in my own view. And it was so unnecessary for us to judge ourselves so harshly. And that's what really made me realize that it wasn't that I was not unique, even though I was made to feel that way, being on the cover of a newspaper and being relentlessly mocked for the choices I had made. You know, we all carry this feeling and it can rule our lives if we're not in relationship with it.
You know, this might seem like an obvious question and also a big part of your book, but why do you think women are more impacted by shame?
So shame is absolutely a tool to keep people in line. And women play an important, I would say, invaluable role, you know, in our economic, you know, culturally, like we have a role to play. And if we're going to step outside of that role, we're going to be reminded. And shame is
Mm.
that reminder, that weapon. So it really is a way to get women to conform and to obey, whereas we might otherwise behave in these ways, but we're being told you must behave in these ways or else. There's the threat of shame, and then there's shame. And then there's watching other women be shamed to remind us, oh, don't do that. but what the book really explores, and what I know to be true in my own experience, is you really can't get it perfectly right. You cannot avoid shame, because you will be too much and not enough of everything all the time. So it really just exhausts us trying to obey and conform. It keeps us small, and it keeps us inauthentic and scared. And that's exactly what those systems want of us.
As you're saying that, I work part-time at a school as a school counselor, and I started sort of going through some of the stories of some of the girls that are at that school too, of just like this so early trying to conform into this perfect whatever, right? It's like they don't even know what it is, but there's something that they're striving for and
And trying
feeling.
to avoid. So
Yeah,
we're trying to be this and
yeah,
we're trying not to be that.
yeah,
And who are we really? Where is our own desires?
right,
Who would we be if not for that pressure?
right.
We don't have the space to even explore that. And that is really why when we say that shame kills, like it figuratively kills a part of ourselves,
Mm.
trying to conform. We don't get to be who we truly are.
You've talked about becoming resilient to shame, and I think that's sort of such a nice phrasing around it because we're never not going to have different
Right.
feelings of shame. Like the different instances can bring
Mhm.
that up for us. And in your book, you talk a little bit about like connection as being like something that's really important in building shame resilience. Is that something that really helped you through that?
It's interesting because people are the threat, right? People, and the threat of disconnection from them is what makes us feel ashamed and to feel shame. But they're also the cure. They're also, when we find the right people, the people that can hold space for us and see our truths and hear our experiences and just remain neutral to that, to remain curious and compassionate and empathetic. When we find that, it is so liberating. I would say for me first, it was writing workshops and people who could read my pages and say, this is good. Imagine
Mm.
hearing this is good when you're spilling your deepest, darkest secrets. Of course, they're talking about the writing, but that was very healing
Yeah.
to see. Like I was making something good of it. I was turning it into compelling narrative. And that was really, really empowering, that I could do something that people wouldn't reject, and not reject me either. And there is that line when it's memoir, like clearly it is me. And they were able to hold space for that. And no one questioned me or criticized me the way I had questioned and criticized myself for so long in my own head. The more we tell our stories and the more they're received with curious compassion and empathy, the more freely we can tell that story, the looser it lives on us. Like now I can tell my story. I've told my story thousands of times. I can tell it without any feelings. But you have to know, when I lost my job as a public school teacher, I tried to get another like normal job. And I would go into job interviews and they'd ask me why I left public school teaching. And I'd just start crying.
Oh,
I couldn't tell that story without being overcome by the feelings, including shame and all the feelings. Whereas the more we tell that story, the less power it has over us.
What a world we live in where it's like the people are the bringers of shame and the taker awayers of shame. And it's like such a fine balance between the two. But I'm glad that you were able to like find the people close to you. I'm sure having
Right.
those tools from recovery, you mentioned that really helped you as well.
Absolutely. And I did have 12-step recovery, and you can go in there and pretty much say anything and it will be held. And I found that I mean it was tricky because I was very vulnerable. I was young. I was talking about sexual experiences. These were not, I was in mixed rooms with men and women. I was pretty naive in thinking that I was entirely safe in those rooms. I started dating someone on day 6 that lasted forever. I mean, I did not do it perfectly. We'll say it that way. But in a way, it was perfect for me that I was able to find these rooms, be entirely who I was in those rooms, and then keep growing and finding other spaces outside of those rooms and other ways of being like appropriately myself. I think initially when we discover the freedom of confession and people who are willing to hear it, it is easy to stay in that space. But it's been so long now. And even then, when I became a public school teacher around that same time, I learned how to live with my story and share it in appropriate ways at appropriate times. Like I was entirely appropriate as a public school teacher. I didn't walk in there and be like, hey, let's talk about hooking. And I think that was an important part of my resilience, is learning how to have boundaries and protect myself. Initially when we're so overly protected and overly guarded, that isn't a way to live. But it's also not a way to live if you're just like completely free with your stories all the time, because we know it's not a safe world, right? And people can use our truths against us. So finding those safe spaces and then learning how to be in all spaces has been the practice.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, and also like going easy on yourself if it wasn't the right space. I think
Right?
like not being critical of like, well, that person didn't hear me, and like, oh, I maybe didn't pick the right person to share this with.
Absolutely. And that's there's moments in the book where we talk about when you share your truth and you're not met with empathy, curiosity, compassion, it can be very harmful. It can feel re-traumatizing, right? And so we have to be courageous enough to keep trying.
I liked a lot of the, experiences and interviews that you have in the book. And there was one that stood out to me just because I'm obsessed with clouds. But I really liked the analogy of seeing thoughts as clouds, and sort of the idea of like you're just sort of watching them pass by, and using that to differentiate like yourself from being how you're feeling. And I think you kind of talked about it in terms of like emotional granularity. So I
Right,
guess, can you
right.
talk about this a little bit?
Absolutely. So that was one of my favorite interviews, and it was with someone who I identified as like exceptionally shame resilient. And I believe it's a Buddhist practice that she was referring to, maybe without naming, but that idea of sort of like naming the mental formation and then watching it move, naming a feeling and watching it move. It's really humbling because I wrote and published a book on shame, and I'm very skillful in some ways, but I'll tell you, I'm very unskillful relationally with my intimate partner, my husband. Like, so beginner. Very, very recently, after years and years of therapy, couples therapy, I was just having this really joyous moment with my therapist, my individual, because I had learned to identify contempt and to just be like, oh, I'm feeling contempt for him, rather than feeling contempt. I mean, you still feel it, but when you just, as I said to my therapist, when you just have this word, you can put the word and then you don't have to do all the other stuff. You can just be like, I'm feeling contempt. And leave that there. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to act it out. You can just know this to be true. That's the only thing that I know to be true when I'm feeling contempt now. And it's so liberating. Like I'm laughing. And I was laughing then, even though I was very angry at my partner. It's beautiful. And that's emotional granularity, right? When you're able to see more than one feeling that you're experiencing at any given time. That was a huge breakthrough for me. And that was like literally 2 weeks ago.
Every couples therapist anywhere that practices Gottman is like, yes, that's one of the four horsemen. She's got it.
So humbling. It takes me so long to know what a feeling is. I mean, my agent suggested that my book was about shame at least 2 years before I was like, my book's about shame. Because I didn't, we feel something, but then we work so hard to avoid that feeling, right? To defend ourselves against it, that it can be so simple and liberating to just know that feeling to be true and to just remain there, or to
Right.
like a cloud and then watch it pass. But you have to feel it, name it, and then it can pass.
So many of us were not taught to connect the emotion that we feel in our body, the sensation, and
Right.
then interpret it and name
Right.
it, right? And
Right.
that's so it also makes sense, I would imagine, in this journey for you, flowing with the emotion of what the book is spilling out of you, and then it takes some time to kind of be able to name what that feeling is, right? Because that's sort of a mirror to how many of us lacked the emotional language and teaching around that as young ones.
Absolutely. And that also was the gift of becoming a writer is you're given words to describe
Hmm.
these nameless sensations in ourselves or what arises in our bodies when we think of the memory of what happened. And to be able to put words to it and to have that word out of you, there's just something so freeing. And yes, to name a feeling, it's incredibly humbling to be learning how to do that in my 40s. But I am.
I find it frustrating how simple the concept is. And I'm like, you mean I could have been doing this for decades? And I haven't. Like,
Yeah, and instead of telling everything that happened and how this
Right,
person's wrong and like putting all of that out there,
right.
just be like, I'm this today. I'm this right now. I was that, to just have that one word.
Hmm.
you have to be willing to take it on, right, as well. So I try and think about that. It's that the younger me wouldn't have listened to trying to take on these concepts.
Well, there's less drama, right? If we can just name it and move on. Like,
Well, I'm not sure we know what these words are either. Like, what
yeah,
does it mean to
right.
what is shame? What is
Mhm.
contempt? What even is joy? Like and to speak back to the point of emotional granularity, it is not always just that. So
Right.
it can be a little complicated to find what we are feeling. Uh,
Hmm. And to be able to, I mean, this is a whole other complex thing we don't need to add on, but then to be able to reframe that sensation as something else, right?
right,
Like, oh, am I anxious or can I reframe that as excitement around,
right.
right? Like, that's a whole other level.
Well, and that goes back to having a story you can live in.
Yeah, right.
So when we do experience when we do work with emotional granularity, when you can kind of name 5 feelings you're experiencing, we can choose which feeling we're going to
Hmm.
move forward with. And
Yeah.
I think in the book I use the example of feeling frustrated when your child just won't put on their shoes, maybe feeling shame because you're going to be late, feeling what all the and then maybe choosing determination or choosing patience, like choosing the feeling that's also there, even if it's choosing sadness or choosing something that's softer or more empowered, just making these conscious decisions about what feeling will help me move forward. And actually, knowing something is contempt and letting it pass
Hmm.
makes space for all these other feelings. I also feel sad. I also feel love. I also feel fear. It's a wild ride once you start to
Hmm.
really, instead of just acting out,
Right.
starting to really feel the feelings and name them. But it's also very, like, I've gotten really good because I've gotten good results from this. And one
Hmm.
of my favorite examples is I threw a party once before my husband and I were married. I threw a party and no one came.
Mm.
I was so embarrassed. I felt ashamed, like it was indicative of me that no one showed up. Obviously, I shared with my boyfriend at the time that I was throwing a party. I thought I can't let him know this happened. And the second I think that, I can't let him know. I can't let anyone know I have to hide this is the second I share something. So it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like this aha moment where I'm like, okay, that's going to liberate me if I can share it. I've had such great results with that it almost immediately takes me out of the feeling of shame into a feeling of hope and a feeling of
Hmm.
humility, which is close to a feeling of joy because it's what I really crave, which is connection and that my human qualities connecting to
Mm.
so it really it's really fun. Shame resilience.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, what you're saying is sort of what you really get to take away from your book. And I liked one of the pieces that you were saying was getting over it isn't the goal, like getting whole is the goal, which was maybe one of my main takeaways. But I'm just wondering, is there any, like, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
Hope readers can see themselves somewhere in the stories. I don't expect everyone to have my story, but there's so many other stories that I really tried to find just this like diverse range of triggers because again, it doesn't matter what triggers it, it's the same feeling. So if people can see their story reflected back to them and feel less alone as a result of that, then I feel like the book has done its work. And hopefully even better, if they can see their story reflected back, feel less alone, and feel less ashamed by that experience, then that is just beyond what I hope for.
Well, I would love to jump into the second book that you picked, which is Mother Hunger by Kelly McDaniel. So, can you tell us why you picked this book?
Right. Okay. I told you off, but I'll tell you again.
I know I was scolding Melissa beforehand for picking this book because it really hit me in the feels. I loved it, but I was also, whoa.
Yeah. So I was working with my editor. I had turned in my second chapter, which was like the girlhood chapter. And she just, very neutrally said, you might want to read this book. Another one of those humbling moments, right? Where like I'm the expert and she's like, okay, here, consult with this expert and what she knows to be true. And it also hit me in the feels. It really, again, put words to an experience that prior to that, I just didn't have language for, what had been missing. And just to, synopsize the book a bit, it's this idea that, adult women, we're not pathological, it's not codependent, all of the other, labels that have been given to us can potentially be attributed to what McDaniel calls a mother hunger, this deprivation that came from a lack of maternal attunement. So it really reframes these common struggles as being the result of these unmet early needs and not character flaws as we might have internalized.
How do you connect mother hunger with shame? That might be a big question.
No, I mean, but that's it, right? If
Yeah.
I think I'm just like, there's something pathologically wrong and different about me, that I have issues with food, that I'm acting out sexually, my relationships are unstable, I have all of these struggles. And I think they're unique to me and they're indicative of my personality. It's individualized, right? So to think of it as, here's a cause and it's not just you. It de-individualizes it, it depathologizes it, so it normalizes it in a sense. And then it gives a little cultural context when the book does do that. Yeah, it's very freeing to know that like I'm not just like inherently flawed and broken because there's something wrong with me. It's attributed to an experience, and it's not a unique experience.
And for listeners who haven't read this book, the author does sort of have an ask for you to consume it from the perspective of a daughter
Not a mother.
and not a mother, which I'm not a mother, but I was reading this going, how does one do that?
Because we're so imperfect, right? And here is what happens when you're a not good enough mom, right? So I'm constantly checking in with my therapist. Am I a good enough mom? Am I fucking up my kid? That's like what I don't want to do. And what I probably am doing because, I'm reparenting myself as I parent them. So like I'm not doing it perfectly. I think I'm meeting my children's needs better than my needs were met. And so there is a bit of that happening as a mother reads, and it's unavoidable no matter what the author requests. It's hard not to do that. And that can bring up shame, right? Because I know that my children, this relationship is so invaluable to them. It's so formative. And that's a lot of pressure, right?
Right.
But yeah, it's hard to mom when you don't have a mom, right? Or it's hard to be a good enough mom when you didn't have a good enough mom.
And it's interesting too because this is the first time I've read that I can remember someone sort of really poke at the good enough mothering idea because I know that it's created a lot of relaxation in mothers to be like, okay, if I can just be like good enough,
Hmm.
right? So I thought this was interesting because she does kind of poke at it a little bit as not a phrase that she really loves. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective on a concept that I think has given a lot of parents maybe some relief. But I also feel like, to your point, or at least how I feel, is it's not about being perfect because that's impossible, but having the relationship where a child can come and say to you, that didn't feel good, or you can recognize it and apologize. And like that's where this concept of like repair comes in as to me, the more important piece of it all, not necessarily being perfect, because that does not exist. And you don't know the things that your child might attach themselves to in the process of being parented.
Right. And this is something that makes me think, and I don't think this comes from that book, but the idea of introducing your children to different people, families, and ways of being, maybe it did
Hmm.
come from that book. It's that's something they say that really builds resilience in a child and helps them to navigate the world and find support when needed and just know there's so many different ways of living. And that's something I didn't have. We were very isolated. And the isolation can breed shame and fear, whereas community breeds curiosity and vulnerability and trust.
This book really outlines a lot of different coping behaviors, or it goes very into like different attachment styles that you might have as an adult as a result of kind of craving this mother hunger. But I'm wondering if you could say, like, why do so many coping behaviors like, overgiving, perfectionism, or numbing, why do they make sense when we think about it from the lens of mother hunger?
I love the term the hungry ghost, the
Hmm.
wanting. So if you didn't have nurturance, protection, and guidance, which are the three primary expressions of the mother hunger, right? Then you're constantly seeking that. There's that seeking, that seeking. I think that the idea that it's a relational injury and not a individual failure can
Mm.
just knowing that is soothing, where it can create a pause between the impulse and the acting out, just knowing that what it is. I really appreciated how this book allows for all the feelings that we have, but there's like this promise to move forward. There's an exercise in the book, the exercise where she asks if you dream of a home, like a physical house, and imagine it. I had spent my whole childhood, like I still do it at night when I'm going to bed. It's the way I like self-regulate. It gave me permission to do that. And it becomes, instead of this kind of like secretive embarrassment, it's this opportunity to almost reclaim that. So I think that like I just really appreciated how true the book felt in places, and again how it really named my experience and helped me feel less alone in that.
I also think of turning towards other coping mechanisms because we don't quite understand what the rupture or hurt is, or by no conscious fault of our parents, we weren't provided with those self-soothing abilities to cope for ourselves, right? And so I think it's interesting to think about it through this lens. There's a little bit of like a softening around what your parent could give or not give you, which I think is always sort of the goal. It's like acknowledging your own feelings and let them being there. And sometimes we can hold the couple perspectives of having compassion for our parent and still holding our feelings about what happened or didn't happen. Another piece that I really liked was the phrase the apology ache. And this made me think so much about this idea of like what you're talking about, like reparenting yourself or inner child work, how, this was like defined as like the ache isn't being like seen or acknowledged, and it's not because you want to punish your parent, but you want to stop doubting your pain. Do you have any advice or thoughts on anything for daughters that may not receive that verbal apology from their own mother?
Oh, wow. It's just so important to know that could be true. So
Right.
just the reminder of the
Hmm.
apology immediately comes to mind how it plays out in my life today. If you're not aware of it, just like if you're not aware that you're feeling shame, you will act out of shame. One of the hugest issues in my marriage is that it's never enough. Even when I get an apology, the tone is wrong. The words
Mm.
are wrong. Like it's never enough because it's not
Hmm.
mommy. It's that is
Right.
seeking what I'm seeking. It's like, okay, you didn't do the dishes, but you apologize, but you sound defensive. Like it's never going to be enough, Melissa. Like it's not gonna like scratch that itch. Right?
Hmm.
So just knowing that, one, I'm not going to displace it onto others, who are disappointing me. If I know I have this disappointment, then I don't act out that feeling. I think, the more we know ourselves and the more we know ourselves in relationship to others, we talk about when shame resilience, we talk about cultural awareness. The more we put our individual triggers into a cultural context, the more freeing it feels. The more we are freed from it. I am freed from the apology ache when I know what it is. When I know what that is,
Hmm.
it has less of a control over my life.
Yeah, to your point, right? Like maybe someone does receive a quote unquote apology, but it's not in the way that you've built it up, or it's not in the way that you
Never.
want to receive it, right? Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
No, and truly, this is like the hugest issue in my marriage. It's because I'm acting out something very,
Right.
very historic,
Right.
trying to be healed, and truly, we can be if we're aware of the original hurt. We can be healed in lots of different ways. But if we're unaware of the hurt and we're seeking healing, it won't. It hasn't, at least for me. It hasn't worked.
Well, and your intimate partner is the one where this is going to play out the most with, because they, through time, and hopefully become your number one attachment figure as an adult, right? So it makes
Right.
sense that we transfer all these expectations and
Absolutely.
aches and hurts on them. And I think another piece that's important about this, and just like you're naming, like we are all responsible for our own triggers, right? Like you can have a dialogue with a partner about something and ask for a change in behavior, et cetera. But it's like, well, no, I'm feeling triggered and I'm responsible for that now. And this is like feels like what you're speaking to is like this acknowledgement of something this person is doing is triggering this young wounding in me, right? So of course I'm like having this tantrum in this way that feels very young, right? Because it's evoked
Right.
this young wound in me.
But they didn't cause it, so they can't cure it.
Right,
Not
exactly.
really.
Yeah, right. And it's not their responsibility to.
Right. And I think one thing I really loved about this book, The Mother Hunger, was the attention it paid to hyper independence. That wasn't something I had really
Mm,
identified as problematic in my life.
hmm.
I thought that was a skill set, something I had, and it is in a way an adaptation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But if you are thinking of intimate partnership, it can be part of the struggle to connect. So knowing where that comes from, and this conversation is reminding me of so much, knowing where that comes from and being reminded that it is a wound.
right.
Even if we can, turn it into an asset, it still can debilitate us when we're unaware of that.
I used to call myself aggressively independent. I was
Right.
just like, oh no, but
Absolutely.
other people already have like technical terms for these things that I'm
Which
just
is
like making
fine
up. Yeah,
Right.
if you don't want to be in an
Right.
intimate partnership with someone. But if
Right.
you
totally.
but if you crave interdependence,
Right.
you better figure that shit out.
Right.
Hyper independence and codependence is also not what you're craving.
Right.
So if we really want to use the language of the book, if you want to be satiated, if you want to feel soothed and whole and satisfied, you have to know what started what you're working with here.
I know I was like smiling so hard when you brought in the hyper. I was like, and because I know Tara, I know myself. I'm like, oh yeah, that piece, hyper independence.
And so many successful, ambitious, committed women
Yeah.
are also a step away from, well, fuck you, I'm out of here. And that's not, that trigger,
Right.
pretty sensitive for me. And that's my practice today, is working on that.
Well, it's like for me, it always comes down to like, do you care more about being right or in relationship right now? Yeah.
Absolutely. When I finished writing this book, it really made me very aware of the pressures that women face. And it made me pretty angry. Like, and my husband became a real trigger, because like men they were really high on my list of like not my friends, right? So I had a lot of mistrust
Hmm.
and rational. I had just done this whole book about the harm that women face as a gender. But I realized this intellectual vulnerability that I had a lot of, I mean, I said it earlier in the show, I had a lot of contempt and feelings of resentment that I kind of lightning rodded onto him. So my next project is really, I want to look at that, and I want to look at how can I love men better, because I would have said a year ago, I hate men, but I love my husband. But you can't love someone and hate them. So that's my next project.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I wanted to know what you were working on next, especially as you sound like you're busy with your teaching and continuing writing, but wondering if you had another book topic. But wow. So are you just in the research stage of this book, or are you kind of writing?
It was initially like I had presented an idea to my current editor. I hate men, but I love my husband. What now? And she's like, what now? Like, what are you going to do with that? You have to answer that before you can pitch a book, But now it's like so clear to me, this thesis, that, I think my expectations of men to heal me, one, are completely unrealistic. My partner, as good of a man as he is, he's not, like, one, responsible for the gender harm that I've experienced, and I have experienced it, as most women have. He's not responsible for it, and he can't cure it, just like what we've been talking about, right? And I think this idea that there's a cultural myth of the one, right? And it's traditional ideals, like even religious, or like that very traditional notion of marriage and the one.
Yeah.
But also progressive feminists sort of perpetuate this idea that if you just meet the right guy, he's going to share the mental load, care work will be equally divided, he will do the dishes as often as you, and you won't even have to ask. I mean, that's not a human being. That's like the perfect parent, right?
Hmm.
This idea that this person is just going to always like see, hear, and understand you. Like, the truth is they don't. And not because they're flawed any more than I am flawed. I'm different. I'm a separate person. So I think I had some pretty unrealistic expectations of my partner. And I've learned how to shift them in my own relationship. And I want to write a prescription for other women who really struggle with resenting their partners and not knowing how to feel differently, feeling like they're settling for not enough, but not knowing how to get what they really need. And again, something's missing, but it might not be something in your relationship.
Wow. I mean, wow, wow, wow. And I am feeling a lot of gratitude right now for you sharing with us and very much being in process with this,
Oh, I'm
right?
so excited about this
Like,
book. I want to talk about it nonstop, even though I haven't read
yeah.
it.
I'm like, I feel, yeah, it's gratitude. I'm like, yes, we're talking about these other books and it's great. And this whole conversation, I feel like you've been open and transparent about you being in transition or
Absolutely. In
in
process.
process with all of
Yes.
these different topics. And I think to me, this is just a really reflection of the work that you have done, like bringing back to the shame book. I'm like, hell yeah, like I'm feeling a lot of gratitude for you. Where can people that are listening connect with you online, or where can they find your book?
My website's just my name, melissa-petro.com. And I do all my classes on there. I work with people individually. I will be teaching a workshop at Esalen in March.
Ooh,
I know.
dreamy.
So amazing. I think this will air in March, but it's like the end of March. I'm teaching Turning Shame into Your Superpower, a workshop. And it's a writing workshop, but not really. It's really like a personal transformation workshop. And I am so blessed to have that opportunity. I did it last summer, and it was just amazing.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or a mental health practitioner or author interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
If you're in California and interested in working with Amanda, you can find her at amandathrockmorton.com. And follow us on socials. We are at Books From Your Therapist on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And you can follow me on Substack at Tara Kremen.
Happy finding a story that you can live in.
And happy finding the right people to share that story with.